I want to start with a sort of big question for everyone, but just a little bit of a spiel to kind of give it some context. We've all had a chat previously, and I think there's kind of broad agreement at the moment across this country that social inequality is a big issue that is playing out. We sort of had this situation where there's a big wealth divide and there's the haves and the have-nots. My biggest concern is that this is going to become intergenerational, that this becomes embedded, especially as what they call great wealth transfer takes hold, transferring wealth from baby boomers, apparently there's trillions of dollars sitting there, to younger generations like millennials and Gen Zs. But there's all different ideas on the way forward, right? So I want to come to each of you with the same question, which is, as I say, a big one. What is the biggest issue in your mind facing New Zealand into 2025? And what's the evidence you've seen in your line of work that makes you specifically concerned about that? Andrew, you're the data man. And I hear also cousin of Liam Dan. Is that correct?
Yes, despite my broad Australian accent, I was born in Papakura and I have many family over here.
Well, welcome back. Well, I think since you have so much evidence to mind, let's start with you. What's sort of the big concern that the evidence is pointing you to for the next 12 months?
So there are many better economists than me in the room, I'm sure. And one of the things I do is collect the data. You're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of money stored up in the baby boomer wealth. There's about 1.3 trillion that we can see in cash and other savings at the moment. And you can probably triple that when you think about stored property and businesses. The reality is that what we're facing into now is kind of the second order effects, what the economists call the second order effects of the policy settings. I look out in this room and I see a lot of people who look like me, about the same age as me, and a lot of the policy settings are now currently set for the preservation of wealth and not the mobility of wealth, and that probably has to change for the economy to do what it needs to do. I'm not seeing a lot of that effect. One of the things that nations, particularly Western nations, are trying to do is trying to immigrate or inflate their way out of this problem, and you can see that around the world. It is enshrining what I call a bicameral economy, a lot of very rich people and a lot of very poor people. And the second order effect of that is tension, which you can see in Germany, France, England, and probably here in the next little while. You do have time to get the policy settings right to overcome that, but if you don't, then it will come, and that's an issue.
We will get to policy settings, definitely keen to have a chat about that. Carolyn, what's the biggest issue you see coming for us?
Look, kia ora everyone, lovely to be here. A bit about my background, I think maybe to contextualise my thoughts, is I do run a communications agency and I have over my career worked with a number of financial services businesses, from banks to insurance to payments, and now absolutely thrilled to work with the FSC. But equally I am really focused on purpose-driven work, so work that delivers outcomes for society and for the environment, and of course has economic benefits as well. I'm also on the board of the Middlemore Foundation, and so I see things through a slightly different lens perhaps to a traditional comms person. So I'm looking at things from an inclusion lens, so that's kind of what I'm looking at. So I guess the big thing for me is trust, and we have heard it over the conference in terms of confidence and what people are thinking and feeling and fearing. But I think the erosion of trust in the last few years is massive, and all of the indicators are pointing to the fact that that erosion will increase. There's an erosion around trust in our political leaders, but actually just overall leaders who are charged and have power to make decisions on our behalf. And you see it more and more in younger people, and then increasingly with women as well. So I think that's a massive piece when it comes to resilience. And the second one is confidence. So if we're confident in where we're heading as a nation, but as people, of course you kind of think, well, where am I going to spend? Who am I going to spend with? And so really understanding and being confident about what businesses are doing, what they commit to do, and what they say they do is actually true, and they follow through on that, and particularly critical with government at the moment. So what they've committed to and what we voted for, will they deliver on that?
On the point of business, Kirk, will come to you, we'll come in order this way. What's the biggest issue facing business? Because they've got a lot on their plate, but what should they be thinking about that's going to only worsen and kind of get bigger for them in the next few months?
the next few months, the next few years.
Going into 2025, so the next 12 months.
I mean, effectively, right now, it's simply making sure there's enough demand. You saw that there was a pretty significant bump in business confidence when the OCR was cut marginally. That's really the cost of capital, and the reduction in the cost of capital is really going to drive, I think, appetite for investment. And that's not going to happen immediately. It's going to take a fair period of time. I was just listening to Christian there say, no new shocks, 3% neutral rate. Cool.
That'd be nice, eh?
I was also thinking many other things were going through my head at that time. I mean, I think that is something that businesses would think about as nirvana now, having gone through the COVID experience and so on and so forth. I think just to talk to your immediate provocation around bifurcation of society, a massive problem for business in a range of ways. One, in terms of the future workforce. And so if kids aren't staying in education or are illiterate when they come into the workplace or innumerate, it's a massive problem for business, and it's a massive problem for productivity. So you get a more bifurcated society because you get angrier people who aren't able to participate. And the consequences of that you see in things that happen to businesses in Newmarket, on Queen Street, and various other sort of centres around New Zealand where people become quite violent towards business owners, and that's a massive problem.
On children specifically, Julie, KidsCan, your charity, does some incredible work, so thank you so much for all that you do. I hope you've got some donations, and if you haven't got more after this, I'll be disappointed. But what's the biggest issue that you see among our younger generations? What's hurting them right now?
It's actually a little bit speaking to what Kirk has said, and I will say, first of all, we're very proud to be the charity partner for this event, and I can see all the QR codes on the table, and we have raised over 9,000 so far from this event, which is really
amazing.
Cool. So keep scanning those
Let's try
QR
hit 10.
codes.
10 would be
Let's
good.
try and hit 10 at least. Look, what we're seeing on the ground in schools, early childhood centres around the country, is the poverty line is actually shifting, which is actually quite scary. So traditionally we would be supporting under the old decile system, it would be your decile 1, 2, 3, 4 schools. We are now seeing an absolute need in what you would call the higher decile schools, even though they've changed the decile system, and that is coming up showing that the poverty line is shifting, and more middle income families are really struggling to make ends meet. We have the highest waiting list now that we've had since ever, basically, over 260 schools and early childhood centres waiting for support. The MSD report released last week into child poverty shows there are 36,000 more kids living in material hardship. That is up 3% compared to 2022. And I guess from an economic perspective, just building on what Kirk has said, we know that a lot of kids are leaving school to go out to work to help their families just survive. And the flow-on effect of that is that they're not staying, they're not getting that good education, they're not getting the skill set they need to be, skilled workers that New Zealand for productivity is going to need down the track. And when you think about the number of kids that we're talking about here, we're talking over 140,000 children that are living in these material hardship and poverty situations now. So the flow-on effect ultimately for New Zealand is really scary, and if we do nothing about it, that is going to become intergenerational and compound our issues even more.
Well, we can't do nothing, right? We absolutely can't. So what is the fix then, Julie? What do we do to create better opportunity for our younger generations? Because if we're failing them, we're all failing.
Yeah, well, I think, from our perspective, we want to make sure... KidsCan was built on the belief that education equals opportunity, which is absolutely 100% true. And so our whole focus is making sure that kids have the essentials, just those basics that we all need to get up in the morning and get to work, shoes, food, clothing, health-related items, so they can just be like any other kid and get to school and take advantage of that opportunity. But what we're seeing more and more, those things are what you call the essentials, right? But it's the poverty of opportunity that comes with that. And what we're seeing is kids don't get the opportunity to look outside their own small, tiny world about and kind of what they could be in the future. So I think KidsCan can't solve child poverty, but we're there to get kids to school so they have an opportunity. There needs to be a lot of policy settings and changes and work done by government to continue to close that inequality gap.
I will come to both of you on the end on government, but Kirk, just on business, what can the financial services industry specifically, but just all business, because every business, big or small, no matter what industry they're in, are all part of the fabric of our society. How can they utilise their balance sheets, their leadership to help fix this kind of issue?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. You saw some of the consequences of the thinking that's already gone and the leadership that's already gone on in the financial services space last night at the awards dinner. It's about being inclusive for customers, and the focus of this conference in terms of resilience, consumer resilience and prosperity is really critical. But beyond that, it's ensuring that people have the opportunities. I mean, if you think about the businesses that are in this room, that are members of the Financial Services Council, and more broadly in the financial services sector, they're massive in terms of New Zealand. So the opportunities that they can provide and the programs that they have in place to recognise and become more inclusive are pretty important to New Zealand's future. But my observation would be that that kind of needs to happen at a vaster scale than what it already has. Business can do it, but I think, to Julie's point, you really need very, very complementary public policy settings to make the most of that and enable the most opportunities for the most kids that you can.
On government then, Carolyn, how do you think the coalition government, not so new now, they've been with us for a while now, a good few months, how do you think they're going, handling these enormous social issues?
Oh, that's a loaded question, isn't it? Look, I think they're always going to have speed wobbles in the first few months, right? So after the miraculous achievement of signing a deal together, they have set about with pace, actually, delivering on a number of things that they said they would and creating the foundations that they said they would. I think the misstep happens where there are conflicting views that are being ironed out. So what's important when I go back to that piece around consumer resilience and trust is we all know this. Do what you say you're going to do, and also avoid surprises. So the first one was, of course, really the own goal of government committing to funding cancer treatment, and then reneging on that when it came time to set the budget. And of course the backlash from health advocates and the public was swift, and that has been remedied, which is great, so they listened. I guess the second one there is the surprises piece. So repealing the smoke-free legislation was a biggie, and it's a biggie across all of society, and particularly young people, but for marginalised communities. So going back to Julie's point there around, we need to think about the unintended consequences of some of these decisions. So I think the erosion of trust that happens when companies and governments, and this government will have to be really cautious about that moving forward, is ensuring that they don't forget about everybody, and they realise the flow-on effects of that and the cost to healthcare, but also cost to future generations.
Is it possible to get trust and confidence back once you've lost it, and if so, how?
Absolutely it is. It's hard won though. It really does take a long time. I mean, I reflect back over that COVID era, and we look at reputation now through a fairness lens. So were decisions made in the toughest times fair for the most people that could be affected? And you look back at announcements that I recall happening, not in this sector, thankfully, but in other sectors where executives took 5% salary reductions, but then imposed 20% reductions on staff. And it's known and it's noticed, and people remember that. And so that erodes trust really, really quickly. So it does take years to rebuild.
Andrew, not only is the trillions of dollars going to shift from baby boomers to younger generations, but they're also the future voters. The demographic of this country is going to change very quickly. How do you think that could potentially change government policies, especially things like taxes and targeted fiscal policy in the future?
I hesitate to lecture any government on their policy settings, and particularly the New Zealand government. I mean, this is a really tricky time for governments around the world, and it is endlessly complex in the way in which people make decisions and the way in which they act. Everyone's right, this is a confidence game, and trust and confidence are pretty closely correlated, and that's kind of not news to anyone in the room. The settings are weak at the moment. We track that globally. Trust settings are rising globally rather than falling, and because they're coming off of low COVID base. But the reality is that people are not yet making big bets on any particular direction because, I kind of hesitate to say this, we're trying to do too much with too little. One of the things that challenges any economy is that kind of Benjamin Disraeli quote, which is, I don't know the key to success, but the key to failure is trying to please everybody. And we're seeing that expand a lot as what we have is kind of fractured governments around the world. There's so many coalitions that are being formed. Coalitions are weak decision makers and they don't tend to get actually anything done. And that's fracturing globally. And you saw this happen in France when Macron was forced to combine with the extreme left to get government. You're seeing it happening in Germany as the AfD rises and the right is swinging back into power. Seeing it happen in England when you've got a relatively weak Starmer government. I think we were all full of hope when the last Labor government was elected in New Zealand, and I'm not going to have a real comment about that, but I mean, one of the common questions I asked my cousin Corin Dan is list the 10 great achievements of that government, and it's crickets. And it's, come on, coalition, they had the power, they could do anything. Taxation reform, no. Education reform, no. Health reform, no. What chance have these guys got? So this is going to be very tricky. But as I said to someone out in the lobby, you know, you're a brave person to bet against the Kiwis, but it's going to take some real work.
Well, maybe we don't leave it up to government then. Perhaps that's the solution. So, Kirk, maybe we utilise business a bit more. We actually spoke recently about that Edelman survey and about how businesses have more faith, really. There's more faith in businesses to unlock and to perhaps build trust. How do you see businesses playing a sort of bigger role there, and perhaps they might have to step in?
I think it's critical, actually. And just to refer back to that Edelman Index, that's the second year in a row that business is the most trusted institution out of government, NGOs, and media. Sorry, which is great news for business. But what does it mean more broadly for society? It means that there is an opportunity for governments to do that themselves. That is, to trust in business, to start to work more closely together on really big, knotty public policy issues, things like housing, things like infrastructure. So a much greater utilisation of the private sector, not just in the execution, but also in the core decision making and procurement. That sounds all very boring, but actually getting that stuff done will make a massive difference to productivity. It'll make a massive difference to New Zealanders' lives when they can get around the place, when their communities aren't shut off from each other. So those things make a significant difference, but it requires governments to trust business as well, right? And as much as the population might not trust governments, I mean, governments do that the other way around to business, and we have to be really mindful. I think if we're talking about a big bifurcation politically, then we don't want to go, one of the big challenges in getting any of these things done is, when you've got big pendulum swings. Now, if you've got a bifurcated society, you're going to get big pendulum swings, and that's really not going to help get anything done by way of execution.
We hear when it comes to business often the term social licence to operate. Do you feel like that is more necessary now in these kind of times, and how should businesses actually be thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing, and Carolyn referred to it, you're seeing many more purpose-led businesses. So they're changing the dynamic of how they're operating, and they're very focused, and their boards are very focused for a broad range of reasons, of course, on social licence to operate, in different ways. That'll turn up in different language around board meeting tables, but certainly people are conscious of it and its connection to their success through, empowering their employees to do stuff, enabling their customers and consumers to consume their products safely, and therefore their future business success. So is it always going to be perfect? No, we're humans, right? It's not always going to be perfect. But I think that the organisations which really do focus in that area are probably likely to win over a longer period of time.
Julie, what would you like to see business do to create more opportunity for younger generations to help not make sort of these social inequality issues embedded?
I think one of the first things is really care and understand what those issues are in terms of inequality. Everyone sitting here in the room, or most of us sitting here, may not know what really goes on just down the road, or in other parts of New Zealand in terms of what it's really like. And anecdotes that I've got here from schools is life is right now about survival. It is about the basics. Children are coming to school freezing, shoes are held together with tape, more kids without uniforms. There's just so much stuff, and one of the biggest ones is food insecurity, which is getting bigger. The reason that we should really care, or business should care, is because talented kids or kids with huge potential are leaving school earlier to go out to work. And when I go out to schools at primary school level, you see kids, and you go out, and I love to ask kids, whatever school I'm going to, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you get all sorts of things. I've never heard banker, though, which is interesting.
What?
I have heard, I get teacher, I politician, why? But a ninja, I mean, you do get a lot of that. I'm like, yeah, me too, in another life. But what I have noticed is when you go and you ask primary school kids, they have so much hope and they're really excited about life. As they get older and they realise that they have no opportunity, or they're stuck in this poverty trap, the hope goes. And you can literally feel it in the room. The kids just don't want to engage, and that's when you start talking at the high school level. So I think business can create opportunities, but also, when you're talking to government, when you're talking to other people, make sure that you're still saying that tackling child poverty and hardship should be at the forefront of government policy, because I think it is starting to slip away a little bit. And if you think of it from an enlightened self-interest perspective in terms of New Zealand's future productivity and workforce, it needs to happen, and it needs to be at the forefront, and we need to close that gap.
Part of opportunity is also policies that enable people to create wealth as opposed to lose it. Andrew, coming back to you, just sort of repeating this policy question that I asked you earlier, but then you gave some sort of great savage comments on the coalition instead. But can you give us some examples of perhaps some taxes or sort of targeted relief where you think could win or lose in that space?
So I certainly didn't mean to attack the New Zealand coalition. The reality is that coalition governments and fractured governments globally are unable to get policy horsepower on the ground. That's not unique to New Zealand, and something we're certainly seeing going. There's a lot of vexed issues in all the topics that have been brought up, and my mind's going at 1,000 miles an hour, because the role of business in solving child poverty is kind of a challenging one. It's to say, it's a little bit like that. There used to be an Australian media commentator called Mike Willisey, only the very old will remember, who would ask the question, when did you stop beating your wife? Of course, we've all got an issue on child poverty, but the role of business in that's tricky, right? That's really tricky. If they're a shareholder's business, their job is to provide a return to their shareholder, and to solve social problems is a tax on the business. That's a role for governments. Yes, businesses should be involved, but to simply say that you should all put your hands in pockets and do it, I don't know. You have to get the shareholders to think about that, and I think it's very important. Trust is also really tricky. There's 4 big integers in trust: authenticity, benevolence, compliance, and predictability. And benevolence doesn't mean giving, it means having aligned goals. Now, having aligned goals is tricky because people have different sets of goals, and choosing the most virtuous goals is a really worrying problem that exists around the world. If we're signalling only virtuous goals, then growth becomes really problematic. What's New Zealand got which is great? It's got a highly educated workforce. What's it really got that's great? It's got a really good system of government and power and controls of the systems. Putting those things to work means people having a really clear focus on what those outcomes should be, but not everyone gets to win. If you stack up the hierarchy like that and get everyone to win, then you're doomed to failure. That's never worked anywhere ever time. Playing to your strengths is something that can absolutely work and tends to work globally. So figuring out what those strengths are: highly educated, relatively speaking, right? Hard-working, relatively speaking. Really reliable, relatively speaking. Completely predictable, relatively speaking. Putting that to work is what needs to work to make this happen. But having an opinion on that, particularly my opinion, I think is less interesting than it should be. There are better qualified people on the stage than me to talk about it. But what's the data telling me? Let's say 3 trillion New Zealand stuck in the system, which has to move in the next decade. How do we put that to work? How do we take that 3 trillion and apply it to the next generation, but advantage the people for whom that is the stored value of their labour? That's somebody's savings, and it ought to be respected, but they ought to be able to find a way to put it to work. So tax settings to allow that to be put to work are really important. Tax settings which encourage that investment in Kiwi businesses. Tax settings which encourage that settings into what you're really good at. You're really good at electronics. You're really good at agriculture. You're really good at manufacturing systems and building all those. And every one of those things has a global market. So thinking about that is something that's really important. But listening to me talk about it, there's better people qualified in every single table than me. So I hand that back to you.
Carolyn, do you think that this coalition is targeting those selling points, given that the younger generations that are going to have that trillions of dollars in capital unlocked are going to be the voters of the future?
Selling points of...
In terms of better education, in terms of how they can unlock tax policies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, look, I think they're being single-minded in their vision around education, health and law and order. I think there's the 3, focus areas of the coalition are clear that that's what they want to prioritise. I think as they go on, though, and we feel the effects of the cutting of health budgets, and when that starts to flow through and how you actually experience the service, I think that's when the rubber will really hit the road. Because, of course, they have to reduce spending, but to what level? And also, again, I come back to those unintended consequences. We've now heard, just in the last week, I think it is, the GPs are really up in arms, concerned about the crisis that there is. We're now short by 500 GPs. I mean, that is alarming. You've got, in South Auckland, you've got people queuing at 6 o'clock in the morning to try and see the GP.
But they could solve that immediately. Everyone, the doctors in England all want to leave. They want to come here. You could solve that in a heartbeat. You could solve the no tax on family trusts in a heartbeat. You could solve the no tax on worldwide income in a heartbeat. You could tax the crap out of second and third homes in a heartbeat, but no one does because it's unpalatable to the baby boomers. So, sorry, baby boomers in the room. I'm one, but time's up.
Yeah, and so it does come back to what the next generation, a voter, whether they are voting now, like my children are 15 and 13, they're very politically aware, and
wow, really?
They are very, and they've got formed views on what they think is right and wrong. And so I think this next generation coming through are really explicit about what they will wear and what they will call bullshit on, really, really quickly, and then they do that in a very open and public way. So I think the other issue that this government, but also business has, is the rise of misinformation and AI-generated information, which is a whole other piece that we could talk for hours on. But younger people are not, apart from your fabulous podcast, of course, younger people are not engaging with traditional media. They do not sit down at 6 o'clock at night and engage with the news bulletins. They are getting their information from people that they admire, that they trust, that they feel have their back, and increasingly that isn't through traditional media and certainly not government. So I think if you were to think about from a financial services point of view, how do you learn from that mindset and understand where we need to go in terms of communicating to your future customers who are learning the traits of their parents, but also they're growing up in this era of uncertainty and they're scared. Yeah, there's anxiety, rising anxiety. And so what can we do to meet them where they are and make sure that they have the information that they're going to engage with and can understand will benefit them ultimately?
I could not agree more on the trust of sort of independent content creators. I mean, that's absolutely a shift that's happened. Julie, tell us about this younger generation. I mean, Carolyn says they call BS on things. I mean, tell us, what they're like so we all know how to deal with them.
Yeah, I was speaking at another panel thing a few weeks ago, and we were talking about is it Gen Z, right? And employing Gen Z versus employing people who are older, and definitely it's a whole new kind of breed of people, and how you have to sort of work with them and talk to them, and they are very politically aware. They are looking for companies that are operating with a social license. And I mean, when I say you should think about your social license to operate, you've also got to make sure it's not just a tick box exercise, right? That's really important. You've got to be deeply committed to it. Otherwise, your customers and your future customers will just absolutely see through it. Look, I think in terms of government, one of the pieces of, things that we've been involved in recently is advice on the school lunches program. And my understanding, even though we've stepped out of that now, is that they are going to ensure that there is still a good, nutritious lunch program going into schools, and maybe even extending that. But when you come back to actual policy settings, and these guys have touched on it, housing's probably the number one thing that we see as a massive issue and a huge area that could be fixed, which would alleviate so much hardship and poverty in this country.
Kirk, to Julie's point, are businesses as aware of this as they should be, given that this generation coming through are their future employees and also their future customers?
I think they face it every day, right?
Along with so many other things, but is it a priority?
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to wonder what will happen when Gen Z hits middle age, and suddenly the tax settings that they were demanding to be so high are affecting them directly. So I think there's a balance. So just going back to your question about what businesses do in that regard, I mean, I think what has happened in New Zealand is we've had a series of constraints, workforce constraints, right? So employers have had to be incredibly adaptable in the way that they engage with their entire workforce, and that will include some cultural elements that they've had to deal with that they wouldn't have had to deal with before. They'll have to do that across probably the broadest spectrum of generations that are employed in the workforce. So not just young people, but also older people as well. So in order to ensure that they have the best capability and skills there, they've had to be adaptable around that. And no more so than, for example, through COVID, where, not only were borders closed, things were still being demanded of people, and businesses were trying to think about survival. So they really needed the best people available, and had to connect with them, and, as I say, be adaptable in the way that they wanted to keep people involved in the workplace, if you like.
You mentioned something interesting at the very beginning about that businesses want to know where demand is coming from. As I said to Christian, the only kind of certainty is uncertainty. I think we can all agree on that. I mean, is there any way that businesses, aside from dealing with this sort of bifurcation and societal changes as well, is there any way that they can solidify confirmed demand for their businesses? Is there anything they can do to ensure that they do keep a certain type of customer on board?
Well, I mean, I think you've seen plethora of examples of it over the course of the conference, where I think through the panels and the discussions that you've seen, what businesses are doing to ensure that they are absolutely connecting not just with their current customer and client base, but what they might have to do to adapt to be appealing to a future client base. So you're seeing that across the board. More importantly, one of the things that has come through is there are elements of uncompetitiveness within our economy, right? Or seen to be uncompetitiveness. And what you'd argue about that is that's not necessarily sustainable over a longer period of time. I mean, if you think about smart, nimble, technology-based companies that can do things more efficiently, more productively, quicker, cheaper, faster, more, those companies are the ones that will win over time. So, So businesses that are in existence now have to continue to adapt at that pace in order to meet that demand. Otherwise, they won't be around.
Competition will come. Question for you, Andrew, from the crowd. What's the global data saying about working from home and flexible working and its impact on productivity and company culture? Does it look positive or negative?
Negative. The reality is that if you want a job, you can work from home, but if you want a career, you better be either very specialised or in the office. It's a really important distinction that you have to make for yourself very quickly. A job means you can work from home, you can kind of cruise a bit, or you can be highly specialised, but a career means building a network and being in the office. Around the world, you're seeing people pushing people back to the office. People are putting a lot of effort in making the office as a desirable place, but we have to get our heads out of our ears. Careers are built face-to-face, human to human, and networking, and that's not done over Teams. I have a bunch of people who work from home in the CoreData Global. We're at 74 people globally. There's a bunch of people who work from home, but they're already being left behind. When I'm looking at the career development of the people who are showing up, getting involved in the projects and really interested in it, it's resulting in some tough conversations. You did fine, it's a good year, no bonus, because you didn't really do anything which changed the organisation. So that's pretty brutal. I'm pro work from home. If you want to work from home, work from home, but don't expect yourself to have a great career if you're in your undies at 10 o'clock in the morning. But that isn't happening.
And if you are, please don't go on Zoom.
You have a great life, though.
Look, I'm pro it. I worked from home last Friday, and losing the commute was just fantastic. I walked down to the beach at 6 o'clock in the morning. I had a swim, and then I found myself at 5 o'clock in the afternoon still sitting in my swimmers in my study working. I hadn't moved for sort of 14 hours, and I thought,
The data
shit.
must have been so good.
Yeah. I get excited by what I'm doing. I'm really thrilled to be doing what I'm doing. And the conversation you're having today is really important, but it's full of unpalatable truths that no one wants to really deal with. We want everything, and we want it for nothing. Guess what? You can't have everything, and you can't have it for nothing. And I feel like kind of Adam Smith, the invisible hand guy, that Scottish economist. And if you read about him, he's a great thinker, but probably not something you'd want to have a beer with. But the reality is, economies create hierarchies. Hierarchies create winners and losers. And understanding what we want to make win, it becomes really important. The challenge is now that my generation is the one that's winning easy because all the policy settings are benefiting us. And it's the brave government who unpicks they could solve housing in a heartbeat by taxing the bejesus out of it, but they don't. They could do all these things really quickly because they think they'd lose power, and they would, but it's the right thing to do for economies. There's been real bravery in Australian and Kiwi economics in the past, but we're kind of lacking it at the moment. We're lacking it in Australia, we're lacking it in England, we're lacking it here, but it's got to come soon. I mean, as much as you hate Margaret Thatcher, the world changed.
Kirk, you got something to add?
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, one of the reasons why what you're seeing is quite a lot of lazy public policy around the world is, obviously populist politics, coalition politics, it makes hard stuff hard to do. But the other thing that I think in the New Zealand public policy context that I've talked a lot with the Business New Zealand team about is a failure to understand exactly what Andrew just described, which is trade-offs. And understand more deeply what those trade-offs are, because you can't have everything you want for nothing, right? So it is really understanding the costs and benefits of a public policy proposal much more deeply. Now, there are some really boring components to public policy. One is a regulatory impact statement. Those things fell by the wayside. So you just get a proposal. Hey, let's do that. That's cool. Let's borrow some money to do that. That's great. Who's going to repay that money? Well, guess what? We'll pass it on to the next generation. That's fine. Not the best way to go. So there is a lot more rigour that can be applied to that process, and it involves having a deeper understanding of what those trade-offs are.
On the debt specifically, Julie, I find this a very interesting point, is that is going to be passed on to the younger generations. There's this theory, and it's probably been popularised by baby boomers, but the fact that Gen Z are lazy, they all want to work from home, they don't want to show up, they just want to they have high demands for wages, yet don't kind of want to put in the work.
Can I squash that? All of this Gen Y, Gen Z baby boomers was written by a man called Douglas Coupland, who was a journalist from Seattle. There is no research behind this. The behaviour curve doesn't shift significantly from generation to generation. Gen Zs have the same number of hard workers as Gen Y and Gen Xs, so that's not really changed. The reality is that there's two big bits of what you're talking about. The idea that you can borrow money generationally is a thing called modern monetary theory, which is an old American economic theory. And the reality is you can, because it used to be that we did printing presses, and printing presses produced money, and money could be stored and hidden. Now it's all digital. China's proved out you can borrow as much money as you like and wipe the debt out, wipe the debt out, wipe the debt out. And if you turn the debt into roads, houses, schools and outcomes, happy days. If you turn it into chocolate and eat it, you get poo. So you need to be building things that are useful, not poo.
Well, on that, and also governments actually like inflation to some degree because it inflates that debt away, to your point. But then that cost also the added loss of purchasing power added onto the debt that the younger generations are having to deal with.
Yeah, but also I think when we talk about, we have an election cycle of 3 years, and then we get a government probably in for 6 or maybe 9 if they're lucky. But there's no future planning, right, that everyone agrees on that actually helps our infrastructure or builds the things that we need on the long term. What you have is governments coming in every 3 to 6 years who just completely change everything, so nothing gets done. The one that springs to mind that some of you may have seen is the infrastructure guy with the big tunnelling machines, who's now gone off to do something over in Scotland because there's no work for him here.
Sean Sweeney.
Yeah. And
Great
so
guy.
I guess, looping that back to what we do, as an organisation, there needs to be a lot of policy settings and government planning that everyone agrees on, and it's bipartisan and it's set in stone, so that we are actually creating the infrastructure, the conditions, the climate for future generations to get involved and actually have meaningful, purposeful work, so we can be more productive. And we just don't see that, whatever government's in power.
Carolyn, but that also then requires like a mindset shift in society and to the people that then accept and then vote for those policies, that there does need to be trade-offs, that you can't have your cake and eat it too. We are going to actually have to give this money to the infrastructure deficit as opposed to something else. So how do politicians sell that, and how do we all accept it?
Yeah, look, actually just riffing off what you were saying, Julie, is I think that we would benefit hugely when you think about storytelling and what impacts and what influences people's hearts and minds. It's about having a vision, and it's about painting a picture of hope and where we're heading as a country. And if we could go back to first principles, when you do this for business, you think about, well, what are your core heritage-based, non-negotiable values as an entity that, regardless of the conditions that you face or the people that may come into power and what have you, this is actually what binds us, and this is what takes us forward. And I just feel like there has been a lot of conversation around how do we get beyond the 3-year election cycles, and how do we actually set a course that is visionary, that we all ladder up to, that is much longer term than that, and it ties back to what we believe as Kiwis and where we want to head as a country. And that is a different kind of mindset and thinking, and then it's about no one being left behind.
Because we there is a real danger because of the breakdown of social cohesion in New Zealand, that we are heading towards gated communities. We're heading towards, we know now that there's a pathway from school straight to prison for some kids. It used to be from state care to prison. It's now directly in some areas from school straight to prison. And we need to, I guess, stop ourselves from slipping back into that third world sort of thing in terms of that level of equality.
Well, Kirk, who's good at long-term thinking, good at long-term strategy planning? Business. Yes. So what can government learn from businesses that are setting, often, out to 2050 targets and initiatives?
Yeah, actually, I think what it requires is the business community, and more broadly the New Zealand community, to say enough's enough. We don't care for your petty politics. What we care for is actually getting some stuff done so that we can connect our communities, we can not spend hours in traffic, all that sort of stuff. So one of the last acts of my time at Business New Zealand was to work with a team and put together a proposal for the membership around a process called We're All in This Together, basically. Look at things that where you might be able to get bipartisan agreement for much longer periods of, the much longer periods of political agreement which you need to build, to agree on long-term goals. Now, it's not always going to work, it's not always going to be perfect, but if you look at, for example, the Infrastructure Commission, the idea is to get a series of projects in there for 30 years that will help set up New Zealand for the next, beyond that 30-year period, and agree that across as many parties as possible, so that people not agreeing, whether or not you have coalitions on the left or the right, if you've got enough people in the middle agreeing about that stuff, it can get done. Now, again, it's not always going to be perfect. We're human. There'll be politics, there'll be petty politics, but it does require people, business people and communities to stand up and say, don't want to borrow that. That's not improving New Zealand in any way at all.
Permission to eye roll, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much.
One last question here from the floor before we wrap it up, and I think I'll give this one to you here, Julie, given it's about the younger generation. If the issue is getting kids out of the poverty trap, are they teaching the right subjects at school currently?
I think it's great that the government is focused on, I guess, getting back to those really core basics that I learnt when I was at school, and certainly have helped me, reading, writing, arithmetic, those sorts of things. But what I would say is, for a growing number of children, particularly in the schools that we support, before they can get into the position where they're actually able to take advantage of that, we need to meet their nutritional, physical needs. And I think also, building on what was said before by Carolyn, we have seen a huge rise in the anxiety side of things for kids in schools. And that's sort of come out of COVID over those times. So I think they're on the right track with getting the education sector back into those core things that we all need, but there's a lot of work still for kids that don't have everything they need before they can really take advantage of those educational opportunities. There was one anecdote here that I thought was interesting. If we talk about proportion of school leavers leaving with UE. So in private schools, it's 76% leave with UE. Not saying everyone has to go to uni. I didn't go to uni. While for integrated schools, it's 58.9%. But for state schools, and particularly lower decile schools, it's around 34%, under 34%.
Wow, only a third.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Julie, Kirk, Carolyn, and Andrew. A wonderful panel today. Thank you so much. Thanks for all your questions.